Amen. Well, as I suggested earlier, today we are not going to have a traditional sermon, which takes the pressure off me. But instead, today is the first day of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And we've observed Women's History Month and Black History Month. And one of the things that we do at the beginning of honoring any particular group is first we need to acknowledge the ways we've wronged that group and think about ways that we can bring healing and restoration and justice. So many of you by now know Elizabeth Okayama, one of our newer members. And many of you have heard me tell stories of how she was a choir director and a lay leader and the staff parish chair and a delegate to annual conference and one of the authors of the first inclusive language hymnal, which was done at the Ecumenical Women's Center. So she has quite a history in the church and quite a history of service. What you may not know is that as a little girl, Liz was rounded up along with her family and many other Japanese Americans and put into a detention camp. And today we're going to tell the story of that. So, Liz, on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. Do you remember that day? And how did you feel about it?
I was too young. I didn't know anything about it. So I didn't have any feelings.
How about your parents? Do you remember them feeling any anxiety?
No, they never talked about it. And I would imagine, as I think about my parents, that they were upset, shocked, and probably ashamed.
Ashamed because of what our country was doing, or ashamed of being who they were?
Ashamed of the country where my father came from. And my mother's family, her parents were from Japan.
So just a few months later, on February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, mass incarceration of over 110,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, authorizing the Army to designate military areas from which any persons may be excluded.
Yes, 2/3 of the persons who were incarcerated were children and infants. I was one of the children at 3 years old. My sister was 2, and my brother was one of the infants at 3 months.
And many of those were U.S. citizens. Is that right?
Well, we were all citizens since we were born in California. My mother was a citizen. She was born in California. And that wasn't a consideration.
The fact that you were U.S. citizens didn't matter, but because you were part of a certain racial group, which the country came to hate very quickly, you were then included in the mass roundup and incarceration.
Through the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was the culmination of a history of racial discrimination against Asians beginning in the 1800s, when the Chinese first immigrated to the United States. Like the Chinese, the Japanese had been welcomed at first as a source of cheap labor, but soon after they became targets of anti-Asian campaigns, and we were called the Yellow Peril. They inherited much of the new prejudice directed previously against the Chinese, especially as the Japanese moved from itinerant farm laborers to become owners of farms and small businesses. Discriminatory laws passed during the 1900s denied the Japanese the right to become citizens, to own land. They could not buy homes in certain areas and were barred from jobs in certain industries. They couldn't marry outside of their race. My grandfather was a farmer, and he could not buy land, so he had to lease the land. And they moved from place to place. And because there was a family of 10 children, they picked up the house and moved the house to wherever they would get new land.
And so eventually you moved to Chicago. And what happened in the early 60s when you moved to Chicago?
Well, that was much later, and as an adult, I was looking for an apartment. And so rather than moving to a place that was vacant and then finding out I was not welcome, I called the phone numbers of the landlords to ask if they rented to Japanese people. Most of them said no, until eventually one person who happened to be Japanese American herself said yes, and that's where I moved.
The mass removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast took place over 8 months, from March 24th to November 3rd, 1942. How did your parents decide what to pack when they left their California home?
Families were registered and given numbered tags to identify themselves and their belongings. They were told to bring only what you can carry. And since the children, we were so young, their arms were filled with people rather than belongings. My mother had to leave her wedding dress and all the things that we had as a family.
Including your pets?
We didn't have any pets, so pets were not allowed to go to camp.
So many families had to leave theirs behind. So many losses occurred during this time, and they were estimated to be in the billions of dollars financially.
Yes, my father lost his restaurant and the house, which was connected to the restaurant. Obeying evacuation notice orders, Japanese Americans boarded trucks, buses, and trains. We were transported to what the Army called assembly centers. 15 detention camps were set up in converted racetracks and fairgrounds. Many families lived in homes in rather horse stalls under unsanitary conditions. I remember my mother talking about that, living in horse stalls.
So you were transferred to the camp called Heart Mountain. Do you recall what the camp looked like when you got there?
I probably don't have memories as a 3-year-old, but the camp was surrounded by barbed wire, and there were armed guard towers with guns facing toward the residents. They were, in fact, prisons. But as prison life evolved, inmates helped organize essential services. They worked in the camp offices, in canteens, in the mess halls, hospitals, and schools, among other places. And earned wages. They were paid either $8 or $16 per month for a 44-hour week. By October 1942, the Army had transferred all inmates from 15 temporary camps to 10 permanent war relocations. And the time in the racetrack was the temporary until we moved to the camps. And the camps were located in isolated areas in vast sandy deserts or swamplands. Inmates who had moved from relatively mild climates in the West experienced frequent dust storms, bitter cold winters, and sizzling summers for the first time. One childhood memory I have is a tornado I saw in the distance. It never came to Hard Mountain, but I remember seeing that. Another memory I have is during a snowy winter, my mother opened the window and gathered snow in a bowl, and then she sprinkled the powdered Jell-O on top of it and made a sweet dessert for us.
Were Japanese Americans who did not live on the West Coast interned?
No, only those along the West Coast of the United States, and also those who lived in Peru and 12 other countries in Latin America. The United States forcibly uprooted over 2,200 Latin American citizens and residents of Japanese ancestry, and incarcerated them in the United States camps too.
What do you remember about life in the camp?
We ate in mess halls where my father worked as one of the cooks. I started kindergarten there, which I don't remember at all. I started taking piano lessons at the age of 4 and played in a recital. Our living space was one room, no toilets. There were public toilets and showers. It was a large building with toilets and showers and public bathing.
But you and your family then were in one room.
That's right. I do remember, I think my mother somehow got a potty for us children, so she didn't have to take us out to the public toilets, especially at night.
So then, on December 18th, 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that the government could no longer detain loyal citizens against their will. This led to the opening of the West Coast for resettlement. So, did you get to just go back to your former life?
No. There were periods of time where the government allowed family, I guess the wage earners, out to where they used to live. My father was determined not to take his family back to the racist California environment. When he went back to look at the place where we left, he saw in business windows signs saying no Japs allowed. So he refused to go back to California and decided to come to Chicago. That's how I got here.
And what happened in 2004, an unassuming Chicago woman becoming the center of a small, bright spot of attention?
In 2004, an unassuming Chicago woman became the center of she became the center of a small, bright spot of attention as Chicago's Japanese American community marked the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the end of one of the most regretful episodes in American history. The Chicago chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League honored 84-year-old Mitsuya Endo for initiating and pursuing at no small personal cost a habeas corpus petition that led to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on December 18th in 1944 that the internment of loyal, law-abiding citizens of Japanese ancestry could not be maintained.
Like so many episodes in U.S. history, this is not one that I was taught about in school. Similar to the Holocaust, I was not taught about. Similar to the removal of Native Americans from their traditional homelands, I was not taught about. And there have been many chapters in U.S. history that are still under great debate today as to whether or not they should be taught in schools. What I wonder is, do you think this could happen again to another group of law-abiding, loyal, faithful American citizens?
What do you all think?
Oh, yeah. Happy to.
So that's the end of our script, and now I'm going to go off script. This will be the fun part. What would you, as a Japanese American, like others to know about other Japanese Americans or Asian Americans in general?
Well, I have met many Japanese Americans during my adult life, which has been long. And there was a gentleman who's a member of one of the United Methodist churches who was instrumental in working toward reparations and legislation against this kind of government behavior.
Now, at some point, you must have encountered the church or Jesus. Do you remember when that happened? Was it in one of the camps, or before, or after?
It was not during camps. My mother was Buddhist, and my father was, I don't know what my father was, but he was a religious leader later in life of a group, I forget the name of the Japanese name of the group, but it was a way of life. I became a Christian at the Presbyterian church that was in our Chicago neighborhood, and walking distance, my mother sent us to the Sunday school, where I learned about Jesus and became a church member, and eventually sang in the choir and started teaching Sunday school at the age of 12. And I remember talking to the Sunday school leader. I said I didn't think that I was doing any good, that I would teach the lesson, and she told me not to worry about it, that whatever I was presenting, the children would retain in their minds. And for doing that, I was given a free session at summer camp in Saugatuck, Michigan, for the service that I provided there.
That's wonderful. And so you spent really the rest of your life serving in one capacity or another within the church.
Teaching Sunday school, yes, or playing playing piano for the junior choir that was here in Chicago at Mayfair. Mayfair was United Methodist.
At some point, you left the Presbyterian Church and started going to Mayfair United Methodist Church.
Yes, right. That's right. I became a Methodist, I guess, at Mayfair.
And then Mayfair closed, and then merged with Norwood Park United Methodist to form a new church called New Hope United Methodist.
Yes, that's true.
And unfortunately, when your terrible pastor was appointed to that church, as SPRC chair, you just had to deal with it.
Are you talking about yourself?
Maybe. I have always been inspired by your faith. And I think it's profound how you and many others have kind of experienced racism, persecution, injustice at the hands of other Americans. And yet you found a way to live and forgive and work for justice and work for peace. I find that amazing.
Well, I remember having heard people shout or say negative things to us when we were children. My mother would just say, don't pay any attention, just ignore them. And in fact, I recall that my father told us that when we were in camp, rather than be angry about being incarcerated, he said that we were safe. We were safer instead of being out in public.
Safer in prison than out in the free public.
That's right.
That's just incredible to think about. Do you think that true reconciliation is possible between Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans and let's say the white folks of America?
I think eventually, yes, there are groups who work toward that. Today, there's an Asian American alderperson now on the Chicago Council. And groups, not-for-profit groups, work toward equality for everyone.
Are there any questions you would like to ask of Liz? Let's pretend it's open season on Liz time. Anything goes. Any questions?
How old were you when you got out of the camp?
I was 6 when we came out. I remember that because we were sitting on trunks waiting for the truck to pick us up to go to the train station. And we were eating ice cream cones because it was my birthday.
So 3 when it happened to age 6 when you were released.
That's right.
How does that affect you today? Mentally, spiritually, emotionally, knowing, your history.
I'll repeat that. The question is, how does that affect you today, knowing that history and everything that you went through?
It's an interesting question because while I was experiencing it, I was very young. And as children, we just played with each other. But as an adult, as I learned the whole situation. It just made me want the United States to become a little more open and accepting and equality for everybody.
Yes.
Did you have older siblings?
Did you have older siblings?
No, I was the oldest of 6.
Do you have any sense of how the older kids were educated during this time?
There were schools in the camps. I attended kindergarten there. And then when we moved to Chicago, I was first grade age. So my mother took us to school and assumed that I would be in first grade. But I didn't speak English. My father spoke only Japanese and my mother was bilingual. So the principal of the school suggested that I spend half a day every day in kindergarten, playing with the children and learning the language that way, which is what I did. And then eventually I got to spend the whole day in first grade.
But it sounds like there were schools in the camps, mostly organized by parents and other residents.
Right, the schools, like many of the things that happened in the camp and were carried on by the residents. I'm not sure about the teachers, whether they were actually teachers in real life or not, but there were schools there for all the children. And the piano lessons that I took, the teacher must have been a piano teacher before she was incarcerated.
Yes.
Did your parents talk about how the prisoners in the camps were monitored? Were they guarded every minute? What was that environment like?
There were guards on guard posts with guns
Guns.
placed all around the camp, yes. The camp was surrounded by a barbed wire fence, and there were guard posts. I guess they didn't want anybody to escape, so they had these guard posts.
Do you remember having guns pointed at you as a child?
I remember seeing the guards up on these tall posts that were built.
Yes.
After the internment was over, did the government provide you means for reestablishing yourself, traveling to and fro to wherever you wanted to live and setting up houses? Did you have to do that on your own, or did the government provide? I
read that each family was given $25 and a train ticket to the destination where they were headed. So I have vague remembrance of being on the train coming. Well, the remembrance I have is my birthday, while we waited for the trucks, and we were loaded onto the back of huge army trucks, which took us to the train station, and then the long train ride to Chicago. When we got to Chicago at Union Station, and we got out of the train, I saw a long line of yellow cars, which were cabs. But in my mind, I thought all cars were yellow. In Chicago, but anyway.
Yes.
I've worked with Japanese American woman whose parents and her uncles went through the same thing. And her uncles felt that the United States was justified in imprisoning them because they were Japanese and you were war with Japan. I was kind of appalled by that, but did you know any other American Japanese that ever said something?
I think there were Americans, and the government anyway, thought that Japanese people would be secretly communicating with Japan. That's the reason that people only on the West Coast were incarcerated all the way down the country and down in Latin America. Because I met a woman who was college age at the time, and she lived in Chicago, so she was not incarcerated. I thought that was kind of strange. But that it was a military, they call it criminal military necessity, that they took all the Japanese Americans away from the coast.
So are you responsible for the rest of your family being able to speak English since you were the first to learn?
No, everybody grew up speaking English because we went to
everybody
school.
just picked it up.
Right. Well, my mother was told not to speak Japanese to us. So we sort of lost communication with my father. Yeah, it is. Today, language is more respected. It wasn't then. So, yes, we all speak English now.
Any others? I'll ask one final one.
Okay.
How has that experience shaped who you are, and particularly your faith?
Well, I think that my father was a very nonviolent person, and I can remember way back when I started growing into a Christianity of always favoring peace and justice.
And some Sunday coming up soon, we're going to celebrate a peace Sunday, a nonviolence focused Sunday, which I'm sure you'll be a big part of organizing, right?
Okay.
Friends, Mrs. Elizabeth Okayama